Hello and welcome. We're going to get started in 1 minute. We'll give everybody a chance to join. Thank you all for coming today. We're going to get started in 1 minute. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. It's Understanding Taste and Smell in Harmony and Discord. I want to do a little housekeeping first. We'll use the Q&A. You'll see that on the bottom of the screen. We're going to have some questions at the end. And there will be slides at the end with resources that you can also find on our website, which is tasteandsmell.world. And this is an event of the World Taste and Smell Association. It's really exciting. We have a great audience today, and it's really exciting that so many of you work in the field. Some are perfumers. I see there are flavorists among us, many people that I've seen in the smell loss groups. And it's great to have a mix of people all learning about taste and smell. Welcome. A big thanks to our World Taste and Smell Association Events Committee, Amy Marks McGee, Gabby Marks, and especially Ariella Halperin, who made this and so many of our other activities possible. I'm Stephanie Foyer. I'm a writer and a marketer and one of the co-founders of World Taste and Smell Association. When I first lost my sense of smell in 2017, my life changed profoundly. I withdrew, I suffered from depression, and I lost interest in so many of the things that once brought me joy, and no one got it. That's one of the reasons I got involved in starting this organization, along with Mindy Yang and a dynamic board. So the World Taste and Smell Association is now dedicated to providing information and insight into smell and taste. We celebrate how these senses work together and make our lives richer and support our well-being. And we strive to support and advocate for people with a range of smell and taste challenges. We do this through our flagship event, Taste and Smell Day, on September 14th, and our Delicious for All initiative to make meals enjoyable for everyone, especially people with chemosensory challenges. And we present events like this to promote a broader understanding of taste and smell. This event, by the way, will be taped, and we will follow up with some resources to you via emails that you registered with. We're delighted that Rachel Hurst is on our advisory board. Rachel is a neuroscientist and an authority on the psychology of smell and a really great writer. I really encourage you to check out her books, The Scent of Desire and Why We Eat What We Eat. Thank you for being here today, Rachel.
Okay, unmuted. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to be part of this panel today. And it's a pleasure and a delight to be part of the advisory board for WTSA. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So I want to start basically with a little bit of an overview of the sense of smell, taste, and what flavor is, as just sort of a little bit of a mini 101 background, and then I'm going to get into how and why smell is so important for our quality of life. So first of all, what are smells? Well, they're chemicals that float through the air that have certain characteristics that enable the apparatus that is inside our nose and connects to our brain to be able to detect them and perceive them as a sensation of scent. Now, at the top here, you see that there's two chemicals. One is menthol, the other is isobutyl methylpyrazine. Menthol to us generally colloquially smells like mint, and isobutyl methylpyrazine smells like green pepper. Now, those two chemicals have properties that enable them to be smelled, but the two at the bottom, methane and carbon monoxide, are also chemicals that float through the air, but we are not able to perceive them in any way. So we don't detect these chemicals as smells or anything else. And what's really interesting, actually, to me in particular, is that the chemicals that make up the air we breathe, helium, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and so forth, are actually all chemicals that we cannot detect. And what I like to think of it as is like the air is a black canvas, a blank canvas, and the scents that we can detect are like the paints on that canvas that we can perceive. So the background chemicals are actually something that we are not built to be able to detect. But all the other chemicals that we can perceive are painted on that and enable us to experience the sense of smell. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. We can detect actually more than 40 billion different chemicals. And what this number is, it's a little bit of a theoretical numeric because nobody has ever counted them exactly. And actually, even if it took us only 1 second to be able to detect every single smell, it would be over 1,200 years before we could go through them all. But basically, what this number is referring to is the guesstimated number of chemicals in the universe that possess the properties physically and chemically that would enable us to detect them as a specific and different chemical note. And I should tell you that the number of chemicals out there in the universe naturally is not the limit on the number of chemicals that we can smell. And in fact, there are companies right now that are working on creating novel molecules that we have never smelled before, but nevertheless possess the capability to be smelled. Now, this really vast number is actually much more perceptual capability than we have in any of our other senses. So, for example, in vision, we have the maximum capability of distinguishing up to 7.5 million different color hues. In hearing, we have the capability of hearing up to 340,000 different tones. But in our sense of smell, it is vastly, vastly greater. And you'll see much, much greater than we have for our capability for taste. Next slide, please. So the other thing that's extremely important with respect to our sense of smell is where in the brain our sense of smell is being processed. And what is really fascinating and really critically important about the sense of smell is where the conscious perception of scent takes place. So when you are consciously saying, oh, I smell lemon, that is actually the same part of the brain where emotions and memories are processed. And this particular structure is referred to as the amygdala hippocampal complex. It's the conjoined areas of the amygdala and hippocampus, which you can sort of see in this cutaway drawing on the left-hand side of your screen here. And this is what's referred to in olfactory study as the primary olfactory cortex. So in vision, we have the primary visual cortex, which happens to be at the back of the head. We have a primary taste cortex, which is somewhere else in the brain. But the primary smell cortex, the primary olfactory cortex, is the amygdala hippocampal complex, which is also doing a totally other thing in our brain, either at the same time or independently. And that is processing and perceiving emotions, emotional memory, and also forming associations and forming spatial maps and doing a variety of other things related to learning and memory that are really critically important for other aspects of our cognition and behavior. And this is why, as you'll see, the sense of smell is so intimately and importantly tied to the basic mechanisms that enable our survival and our quality of life. Next slide, please. So when we're smelling in a daily life, we are typically smelling in two ways. And one of them is probably the one you're thinking of right now, which is sniffing in through our nostrils. And this is referred to as orthonasal olfaction. So you sniff the rose, you may sniff the steak that's grilling as it's being cooked. And this through our nostrils is referred to as orthonasal olfaction. And what's happening here is that the air carrying these various volatile chemicals that we can detect are being pulled into the nose as we breathe in. And these chemicals are reaching an area called the olfactory epithelium, which, if you can see it, is right here, this sort of patch of mucous membrane at the top of our nostrils, which is related to where the olfactory receptors for detecting smell are. They're actually sticking out of this mucous membrane and directly exposed to the environment. This is also something unique with respect to the sense of smell. None of our other sensory systems has the sensory neurons for detection sitting right out there in the real world. And this is actually one of the reasons why our smell is so vulnerable to environmental perturbations. And in fact, were it not for the capability of regeneration, which is a normal feature of a healthy functioning sense of smell, that these sensory neurons are constantly being regenerated, we would all be anosmic before we were 5 years old, because the environment would have ended up killing off these sensory neurons, which are directly exposed. But with a normal, healthy functioning sense of smell, these neurons are constantly regenerating, such that about every month or so, we are effectively getting a new nose. Now, the other mode of smelling is when we're inhaling while we are eating, and this is called retronasal olfaction. So this is when we are breathing while we're chewing food, which is what's normally happening. And the air carrying the molecules of the food that we're chewing in our mouth actually goes through the back of the mouth and up a passageway that's an open airway system between our nose and mouth, and goes up into the nose and actually goes to that same patch of mucous membrane where the olfactory receptors are sticking out. Now, if you've ever had a really bad cold or allergies and your nose is blocked, then you know that smooth food doesn't seem to taste right. This is because the mucus between your nose and mouth is actually blocking a good flow of airway, to bring the molecules of scent that are in your mouth from chewing food up to this detection center of olfactory sensory neurons, and why food doesn't seem to taste right when our noses are blocked. But the other really interesting thing about this is that the fact that we have an open airway system between our mouth and nose is the reason why humans have a risk of choking while eating. So, as your mother told you, don't chew with your mouth full, or talk with your mouth full, rather. Chew with your mouth full, definitely. Don't talk with your mouth full, because talking is bringing air in. And depending on how voraciously you are speaking, if you're chewing at the same time, it's possible for that food to get lodged in your windpipe. And actually, there are thousands of choking deaths each year in the United States alone. But talking is also another major reason that retronasal olfaction is really something fascinating, because with this capability of air circulation from our mouth to our windpipe and out through our nose actually enables the sounds that are necessary for speech. So the evolution of speech and the evolution of flavor, as you'll see in a second, are co-entwined. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to explain the differences between taste and flavor, which I've alluded to a little bit already. And so taste is, in fact, a very simple sensory system. Rather than 40 billion possible sensations, there are 5, maybe some more if we start bringing in things like electric taste and fatty taste, but those are still controversial in the chemical senses academic world. But what everybody agrees on, generally speaking, although some people want to take umami off the list, but we have only 4 or 5 basic sensations. So we have the ability to detect chemicals that are relevant for salt, chemicals that signal sour, chemicals that signal sweetness, chemicals that signal bitterness, and another set, which is umami, which is the Japanese word for deliciousness, is this sort of depth of taste sensation, which is triggered by monosodium glutamate, or in this case, you see soy sauce. Now, so you see that these are sensations that take place within the oral cavity, within the mouth, and are restricted to that area of the body. Now, when we are eating food, what's happening is, for instance, in the case of steak, you have the taste of salt on your tongue, plus, as you're breathing while eating, the aroma of steak, and together that's fusing together to make the perception of the grilled steak. Next slide, please. So go back, please. Slide back. Okay. So flavor, no, one forward. Yes, thank you. Flavor is the fusion of a basic taste with scent. So for example, when you're eating a chocolate cake, what you are perceiving is the taste of sweet with the aroma of chocolate in your mouth, giving you the perception of the flavor of that cake. You're also getting other tactile sensations. So maybe it's chewy, maybe it's creamy and so forth. But the basic aspect of flavor has to do with the aroma of chocolate with sweetness. And for steak, it is the taste of salt with the aroma of steak. Next slide, please. So what's going on is your brain is actually fusing these sensations of aroma and taste together and creating this perception of flavor. And the reason we all say the word taste when most of the time we're referring to flavor when we're talking about food is because it seems to all be coming from the mouth. And so this is what's referred to as the taste localization or the flavor localization illusion, because it's actually taking place in your brain from your nose and your mouth, but we use the word that refers specifically to sensations in our mouth. And here's a little experiment that you can all do at home if you have some jelly beans or some other candy which is easily accessible. What I would invite you to do is put one of those jelly beans or candies into your mouth and then plug your nostrils and swish the candy around, or if it's a jelly bean, chew it a little bit, and what you'll perceive is sweetness, most likely, unless it's a mint Altoid or something else where you get some other sensations. And then when you release your nostrils, you're going to get the full-blown sensation of what that candy was. And it's great to do this with jelly beans because there's so many different flavors. So if you pick up a yellow one and then you release your nostrils, you'd be like, aha, that's yellow, that's lemon. Or if you have a red one and then you release your nostrils, be like, oh my God, that's cherry. And the black one, oh no, it's licorice. So you get to have a lot of these little mini sensation experiments when you do it with the jelly beans because it's so quick and easy to do it that way. Another really fascinating thing is that the sweetness of the jelly bean actually gets stronger when you can also perceive that it's licorice or lemon. And this is because taste and smell synergize in our brain to create an even more intense experience. So people who don't have a sense of smell actually are also experiencing a somewhat weaker sense of taste as well. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to segue off to now, and what I think a lot of the rest of the discussion is going to be about, is olfactory dysfunction, and how, by contrast, what I'm going to be really highlighting is not only that these are things that go wrong when we don't have a sense of smell, but why the sense of smell is so important for a healthy and positive existence and to enhance our well-being. Next slide, please. So there are many causes of olfactory dysfunction and loss. The most common is upper respiratory tract infections. This is well before COVID. This was actually the #1 cause. Since COVID, there have been millions of people afflicted with smell loss. And up to now, it's estimated, although this is quite a moving target, that there may be up to 30 million people who have persistent smell loss from COVID. We really don't know how long this may last, how permanent it may be. But in any case, upper respiratory tract infections have a long history of causing smell loss to varying degrees and varying degrees of recovery. There's also the possibility of having obstructions in the nose, so nasal polyps that block the air coming in to get to the olfactory epithelium. Luckily, however, that this is something that can typically be treated with surgery and the person can get a normal sense of smell back. The second most common cause of olfactory dysfunction or loss comes from injury or accident. And typically this happens, can happen very easily in a car accident. It can happen with sports injuries, anything where the person gets hit hard at the front of the head or the back of the head, basically at the level of the eyebrows. And this is because at the level of the eyebrow, there's a thin, bony structure called the cribriform plate. And it is through the cribriform plate that the olfactory sensory neurons send their axons into the brain. And what happens when people get hit hard at the front of the head or the back of the head is this little bone actually jars forward or backwards. And when it jars forward or backwards, it slices off the olfactory axons and causes olfactory loss. Now, normally, also because I said that the sense of smell is constantly regenerating, these sensory neurons have this regenerative capability, it would be possible technically to regain your sense of smell after an accident or an injury like this because of the olfactory sensory neurons being able to regenerate. But what typically happens when anyone is hit hard enough at that level is that inflammation occurs and it causes the little tiny holes in the cribriform plate to scar over, so that even though the axons and the sensory neurons regenerate, they can't get back up into the brain. So it's like this barrier, like hitting a glass ceiling. So the neurons are there, they just can't get out and into the brain. And depending upon the level of severity of the accident, there may be some access points back into the brain, or there is some possibility for them to still get through. But in other cases, this can lead to permanent smell loss. Another way that smell loss can occur is through the normal ravages of aging. So as we get older, one of the things that tends to happen, our hearing gets worse, our eyesight gets worse, our sense of smell also tends to get worse. And this is because the regeneration process isn't happening as effectively or as efficiently. So the neurons that are dying off aren't being replaced quite as well or as quickly or maybe at all, so that over time we have less and less capability and sensitivity to smell. But there's a great deal of diversity and variability. So there are people well into their 80s with a perfectly normal sense of smell, and people who are a lot younger, like even in their 40s, who are starting to exhibit smell loss. And this is where the issue of neurological disorders becomes important. That there is the issue that Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease are both signaled by a diminished sense of smell, often over a decade before any of the other symptoms of the illness are manifested. So, if you know someone or if you yourself are relatively young and starting to experience olfactory difficulties, it's really important to get this checked out, because it could be an early warning sign for one of these other debilitating neurological and progressive diseases, where the sooner that treatment can be brought on board and remediation starting to take place, the better the prognosis is. Other forms of causes for loss of smell are environmental toxins. So one of the things that people have talked about with respect to climate change and the pollution in our environments is actually people who live in really polluted environments have a diminished sense of smell. And with the industrial ravages that are taking place on the planet as we speak, it's possible that there will be a time when there's so much pollution that we are all effectively suffering from some degree of smell loss. But generally speaking, these days, people who live in really congested cities actually tend to have a somewhat worse sense of smell than people who live out in the countryside where they're exposed to less pollution. And certain medications can also lead to smell loss, particularly those involved in chemotherapy, but also even antidepressants, antihistamines, drugs for cholesterol, and so forth. But this is also quite individual and quite individual with respect to the medication. And the final and least likely form of smell loss is actually congenital. This is being born without a sense of smell. Only about 6 in 10,000 people are born with this condition. And what I'm going to be telling you about the problems that happen when people lose their sense of smell is not really applicable to people who are born without a sense of smell. Their brains are wired differently and they function generally perfectly fine, other than not being able to detect some of the dangers in the environment. Next slide, please. So one of the issues, as many of you who have joined this webinar are very well aware of, is that both smells are invisible and olfactory disorders are invisible. So there's nothing that indicates to anyone else around that there's anything that seems wrong with you. You're not walking with a cane, you don't have a wheelchair, you don't have a seeing eye dog, for example. You don't have anything that seems to signal, or even a therapy dog for that matter these days. You don't have anything that signals that there's anything that makes you struggle with the world around you or experience the world around you any differently from anyone else. And even now, although it's better now that there's a great deal more community, but even now, it's very hard for other people to understand the real difficulties of life that people without a sense of smell or with profound smell loss have to go through. So I'm just going to run through quickly what some of these things are as to highlight, the importance of having a functioning sense of smell. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've already brought this up, but the pleasure of food is a basic pleasure of existence that most of us get to enjoy multiple times per day and is really challenged when people have smell loss. So basic smell loss takes away the aroma component of our experience and really reduces these sense the experience of eating these things to texture and or the basic taste that's involved. So salty or sweet or maybe some sour. And so when people lose their sense of smell, it can become extremely discouraging to go through the loss of pleasure that food normally brings and so reliably brings to us every day. Next slide. So as I said to you before, flavor is aroma. Next slide. Next slide. And without having the aroma, what a person would, oh, go back, please. Without having aroma, what a person who only, for example, experiences taste is experiencing when they have steak is this shadow of knowing that there is a steak aroma I used to love, a steak flavor I used to really enjoy, but I can't get that anymore. And likewise with chocolate or any other delicious sweet, I know it's there, it's hidden, it's hiding, it's, if only I could get to it, but you're not getting that sensation. Next slide. Next slide, please. So one of the things that tends to happen for people when they lose their sense of smell is nutrition is brought into peril potentially because the pleasures that we can still get from oral sensations are salt, sugar, and fat. Next slide. And so what often happens, especially early on, is people will just go for those high hedonic hotspots of salt, sugar, and fat, which tend to be in high calorie foods. So there is weight gain. Next slide. That just to also bring that up, there tends to be, just referring to the last slide, also a lot of yo-yoing in weight, which is not healthy. And so overall, nutrition can suffer if people are not really diligent about eating properly. Another thing with respect to food is the food safety in and of itself. So the CDC in the United States estimates that about 3,000 people each year alone die from food poisoning. So if the food that you are eating does not look green or black, you are relying on your nose to be able to tell you whether or not this is something that you should eat. So food safety is another concern, not just poor eating. Next slide. The other aspect, of course, is home safety and the issue for being able to detect when natural gas, if you use that in your house at all, is building up and present. So what happens is actually natural gas is one of the chemicals that we cannot detect in the real authentic world around us. So the gas companies actually put in another chemical that gives it that kind of skunky smell that if you have a sense of smell, you can perceive, and that indicates that the pilot light has gone out and you need to do something to remedy this situation. Even like people who live in areas where they can tell that natural gas is in the street, for instance, because there's been some kind of a leak. This is also really important because explosions can take place. It can be really dangerous. And in fact, there's over 200,000 gas leaks from the main distribution centers in the United States alone each year. So that could be taking place. So if you're walking down the street and you smell something that smells kind of skunky, then you should call your local gas company because there's a leak somewhere and this could lead to explosions. So the issue of home safety is also very important. Next slide. And even with respect to our physical health and lifespan. So in a major study of community dwelling adults who were 57 years or older, people who had a diminished sense of smell were 4 times more likely to die within a 5-year period than people who had a normal sense of smell who were exactly the same in terms of general physical and demographic characteristics as the other people who did not have a sense of smell. So just not having a sense of smell is a potential serious health hazard and lifespan hazard. Next slide, please. Another area, so kind of moving from the physical to the psychological and emotional of life that is very highly impacted by our sense of smell is our social life and our sexual intimate life. So the bonding between a mother and a child is critically involved in the scent of that baby. So mothers can detect their baby from any other baby born in a maternity ward within that same exact period, within 5 minutes of having given birth. Babies can detect their mothers from other mothers on a maternity ward within 1 hour of having been born. So the scent bonding between a mother and a child is really intimate and deep. Even social relationships like friendships are connected to how each of you smell. And sexual relationships are extremely intertwined with the sense of smell, and especially for women. Don't have time to go into all the details here, but there's actually a really important evolutionary biological reason for this. Next slide, please. Our cognitive capabilities are also deeply entwined with our sense of smell. So, as I mentioned, the hippocampus, which is part of the primary olfactory cortex, is also doing many other complex executive brain tasks, among them spatial learning, spatial memory. People actually with a diminished sense of smell are not as good as working with maps and doing other sorts of spatial tasks as people who have a fully functioning sense of smell. And other kinds of complex analytical skills are also dependent on a healthy functioning sense of smell. Next slide, please. And of course, the other side of that equation, the amygdala, which is involved in emotion and emotional memory, is also deeply affected by our sense of smell. So when people lose their sense of smell, they tend to fall into a depression, not only because their lives have changed profoundly and all the things they have to cope with now, which is certainly a major reason, but also because the amygdala is not getting the normal input and activation it does from perceiving smells in the world around us. And so it starts to malfunction as well in and of itself. Next slide. And of course, our sense of self, our memory, and our nostalgia is linked to our capability of smelling. So, as Proust famously wrote about, scents can bring back memories that are deeply buried that tell us about our past. Nostalgia is very potently evoked by our sense of smell. And nostalgia, in and of itself, also has a lot of positive psychological characteristics. It increases our well being, it increases our sense of optimism, it increases our sense of connectedness with the world around us, and also increases our sense of self in general. Next slide. Next slide. So overall, as I've just said, our sense of smell and our sense of smell, our sense of smell and our sense of self are deeply interwoven. And when one is missing, particularly the sense of smell, the other starts to become challenged. Next slide. So for our overall quality of life, our sense of smell is extremely important. Next slide. And I just want to summarize what I've told you. So I'm talking about what happens when people experience smell loss, especially if they don't have much support to help them through it. And depending upon how long their sense of smell is compromised for, the problems can become progressive. If it's a short-term smell loss, obviously the trajectory is much better and full recovery can be made physically and emotionally. But for people with long-term smell loss, the aspects of our lives and well-being that are affected are the enjoyment of food, physical health, emotional health, social and interpersonal behavior, our memory, our sense of smell, or sorry, I want to keep saying this, smell and self are totally related for me, our sense of self, and our overall quality of life. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fabulous. You could go to the next slide and the one after that as well. I'm going to talk about when things go wrong. COVID shone a spotlight on anosmia, but there's so many other kinds of smell and taste loss. The NIH reported that even before COVID, 13 million people over 40 suffered from smell dysfunction and 20 million suffered from alterations in taste. And that's likely significantly underreported because, as you'll hear, there's so many types of smell and taste loss and many more causes. And it's important to know about all of them, even their strange clinical names, because taste and smell dysfunctions are way more than on and off. And learning about what goes wrong helps us remember how nuanced each of our perceptions and our misperceptions of smell and taste really are. We all experience smell and taste differently. Next slide. Because there's a range of experiences, I fielded a quick and dirty poll in some of the Facebook and Reddit groups that I've been a part of. By the way, these groups can be a lifeline if you want peer support. There'll be links at the end of this session. The responses really reinforce my experience. that these disorders are life-changing. People feel isolated. 33 quarters were concerned about their own odor. That I could totally relate to. When I first lost my sense of smell, it was August in New York, and before I would go meet anybody, I had to run to the ladies' room and kind of scrub under my armpits because I was so concerned about my personal odor. Majority of people said they felt frustrated. You could go to the next slide, and friends and family don't get what it's like. Their lives have changed from weight loss to washing things on a schedule to the lack of enjoyment, or one person shared, the world seems flatter. On the next slide, you'll see that people say they can't eat the foods they once enjoyed, and many stop cooking for themselves or dining out socially. The next slide shows that people miss the smell of coffee, of baking bread, of cookies. One woman shared, I had 2 babies. I was never able to smell them, and it breaks my heart. The next slide will talk about the classifications of smell loss. It's quantitative, it's like on, off, and maybe. Anosmia, you've heard of, that's total smell loss. Hyposmia is when you have the reduced ability to smell, and hyperosmia is a super smeller. Now, that's great if you're a perfumer, but some people find this distressing. They prefer unscented products. My mother was a super smeller. And I remember I once put on a clean t-shirt to visit her, and after she hugged me, she goes, whoa, it's like being insulted by Tide. She didn't mince words. Next slide. Lots of conditions deal with the quality of olfaction. Dysosmia is an umbrella term. It's used sometimes in the medical community, older academic research. Troposmia talks about any kind of change, a distorted perception of smell. Parosmia, which we're going to hear a little bit more about later from Chrissy Kelly, is an altered perception. You can detect the odor, but things don't smell the way they should. They smell foul instead. I think of it like getting on a train, but you go to the very wrong station. A type of that is cocosmia, which is a fecal smell. And sometimes, less common, the distortion comes in a perfumey variety called euosmia. Phantosmia is an olfactory hallucination. Rather than being triggered by an odor, it's triggered by an emotion or a memory. I was in New York for 9/11, and the smell that lingered imprinted in me, along with that feeling of loss and grief and the fear of facing the unknown. And that smell came back to me in a long phantasmic incident at the beginning, the early days of lockdown, because those emotions were very much the same. And then if you can't, if you can smell something, but you don't know what it is, that's called agnosia. On the next slide, Gia Klein is an actress and an advocate for congenital anosmia. As Lady Gaga says, some people are just born this way. You could listen to what she says about congenital anosmia. On the next slide.
Hi, I'm Dia, and I'm a congenital anosmic. That's right. I was born without the ability to smell. And yes, to all those misinformed ENTs, doctors, and curious bystanders out there who told me I couldn't taste if I couldn't smell, I'm pleased to inform you that I do indeed have a highly developed sense of taste, both aesthetically and literally. I'm part of a widely misunderstood and largely unrecognized group inside of the world of anosmia. We are the anosmics who never lost their sense of smell, but instead adapted to life without ever having one. Now, the first rule of being an anosmic is to talk about anosmia. Because in order to understand the world of anosmia, you have to know and acknowledge that two separate conversations and perspectives exist, the congenital and the acquired. Most people, including a lot of scientists and doctors, don't consider the congenital experience as being any different from the acquired experience. They view all forms of anosmia as a dysfunction and color our reality through a lens of loss, sadness, and depression, when, for many of us, that is simply not the case. Anosmia is a spectrum, and each person's lived experience and abilities are real, valid, and a valued part of the conversation. So, the next time somebody mentions anosmia, be part of the awareness revolution and ask them which type they're talking about, acquired or congenital, and watch as their eyes and face cross into confusion at the idea that there could be more than one conversation. Educate them on the differences and tell them I sent you to talk about anosmia. Not Fight Club, Anosmia Club, where I beat people in a blind taste test and then make them smell my armpits. Nobody said life was fair.
So you could see, we'll have some links to some of Dia's other videos up on YouTube. When I lost my sense of smell, I was surprised that I also lost my ability to detect flavor. No matter what I tried, everything tasted like cardboard. I'd never even heard the word agousia, which means the inability to taste. A limited ability to taste, where you can detect bitter, sweet, salty, umami, but you can't get flavor. That's hypogeusia. And then there are super tasters. It's a great gift for chefs, but when you lose it, and it's really particularly hard. One of our events last year was featured culinary professionals who shared how hard it was to grapple with smell loss, to lose both their profession and their joy. Next slide. Dysgeusia is an umbrella term for taste disorder. Parageusia is a distorted sense of taste, very much like parosmia. It's when you eat something and it tastes sometimes metallic, sometimes vinegary. And phantageusia is when you taste something, but there's no trigger, there's nothing there. Next slide. Ageusia, agnosia is when you taste something, but you cognitively can't figure out what it is. And burning mouth syndrome is sensate. It's not triggered by foods. I've been told that it feels like you've eaten too many hot cinnamon candies, but not in a good way. Next slide. So what causes these disorders? So many things. You know, smell is our most ancient sense. It's intrinsic. So it makes sense that our senses are assaulted when the body is in a state of disease. Next slide, as Rachel mentioned, allergies and infections cause inflammation that blocks the receptors from receiving and sending their smell messages. And up to 40% of people with allergies suffer from some kind of smell or taste disorder. Sometimes disease damages the nerves, and sometimes they regenerate. COVID, we found out, damages the supporting cells around the olfactory receptors. You could go to the next slide. Injury and trauma, as Rachel mentioned, because of the vulnerability of our olfactory bulb, is an issue. Sports injuries, cheerleading, football, soccer, bike accidents, falls, all cause damage to the olfactory bulb. Next slide, as Rachel mentioned, Parkinson's disease and neurodegenerative diseases are people with these diseases are really profoundly affected by smell and taste disorders. There's so many conditions, as you can see on this next slide, from Alzheimer's to Bell's palsy to Kalman syndrome, which is a congenital, to Sjogren's syndrome, which is an autoimmune disorder that is becoming more common. All of those can affect your taste or smell. You could go to the next slide. The damage to taste and smell receptors because of chemicals is huge. I know that for me, I used to live over the Midtown Tunnel, and I moved up to the country, and it really did make a difference, not being exposed to those pollutants all the time. It's a big issue, too, for veterans who are exposed to military burn pits, that they've been through enough, and then they also lose their sense of taste or smell. Next slide. If you've taken Paxlovid, you know that medication can cause taste distortions. But it's astounding, really, to look at the range of medications, from antibiotics to anti-seizure medicines, certain antidepressants, antifungals, terbinafine, medicines that treat MS. And personally, it really makes me mad that smell and taste loss seem to be an acceptable side effect. You could go to the next slide. Cancer diagnosis is just profoundly devastating. And there's so much that goes into thinking about your treatment that it's hard to necessarily think about the side effects. But between 20 and 80% of people, depending on the specific treatment, will suffer from smell or taste loss because of the treatment that they've received. What's that like? A gentleman from Canada reached out to us at the World Taste and Smell Association around Taste and Smell Day last year, and said that he appreciated all the stuff that we were doing, because he'd suffered smell and taste loss from his cancer treatments. I'd like you to hear from Paul Dube about his experience.
Hi, my name is Paul, and I'm here today to tell you about my story. So my journey starts on January 2016, where I was diagnosed with a stage 4 throat cancer, inoperable. The solution was 8 rounds of chemo, 30 rounds of radiation to my neck. And on June 14th, 2016, I finished all of those. And thank God my tumor was gone, but unfortunately I was left with symptoms. And then we get to learn to manage those symptoms. So my symptoms are, I have absolutely no sense of smell and or taste, zero. So at first it's shock. And then when you talk to your medical team, they say that it's common to have that. It's also common to have metal tasting, different other, because all the cancers are different to all the individuals. So now I went from shock to hope. And then as time grew on, my hope became despair. This wasn't going to change. So what's it like living without smell or taste? It's like living in a bubble. You are alone with your own thoughts, with your own smell, with your own, whatever you can interpret as taste. One goes back to his memory. So it's true that we use our other senses to help the ones that we've lost. So I eat based off of history. I eat based off of what food looks like and what I can remember of it. I can't smell anything, so it's very difficult. It's again, like I said, it's like living inside of a bubble. There's a lot of despair. Even to this day, I go shopping or I go to restaurants. I still think if I'm going to order this particular meal, by the time it gets here, I'm going to taste it. I'm going to finally taste it. So you go from an extreme high to an extreme low, and it just takes the wind out of you, because the reality is you can't taste anything. So what happens is we become a disability that's invisible. People still look at you and go, wow, you look great. You know, you're in shape and you're this and you're that. But it's because people don't understand. You can't pretend not to taste. So it's an experience. And there are challenges. Some days are good, some days are not. Thank you very much.
So there's some other causes. Rachel mentioned polyps that cause blockage. Dental treatment sometimes causes taste or smell loss, and malnutrition or zinc deficiency or some other vitamin deficiencies can also cause smell or taste loss. Next slide. Hormonal changes can also lead to smell or taste loss. You know, those cravings for strange or different foods that you hear about in pregnancy may be the material for jokes, but it also reflects some real biological fluctuations that impact taste or smell. And as Rachel mentioned, as we age, our factory cells don't regenerate as well as they used to, and that impacts the quality of life for elders. It's been known that scent therapy can help bring people out of their shell when they have Alzheimer's, in the same way that smell training has helped so many of us who have experienced acquired smell loss. For me, parosmia was worse than smell loss. That foul parosmia smell put me in a foul mood. Sometimes I didn't even see how I could go on. And Chrissy Kelly, who founded the Absent Support Groups, which got so many people through COVID, she helped me, and she now runs the CKOS network. She helped me see it differently. Parosmia, she said, means that some sense of smell was returning. I was getting odors, but they were just not making the right connections. She's going to tell you more about living with parosmia and some fascinating research into the triggers.
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for inviting me. It's really a delight to be in front of you today and talking to you a little bit about parosmia and my own personal journey with it. Like Stephanie, I lost my sense of smell in 2012 and had a very long road to recovery through the sort of resolution of parosmia that took 8 years. I know we still talk in the network and on the other platforms about how long it takes to recover. But, you know, for me, it was a very, very long time indeed. And your end point is perhaps a slightly different sense of smell, but one that nonetheless gave me a great quality of life. And that is where I am today, in spite of 6 cases of COVID. Let's see. I think we can go on to the next slide, please. Many of you know that I was already well established on Facebook with Absent, the charity that I founded in 2019. So there I was with my original Facebook group when the pandemic hit. And that is quite an interesting story in itself, but suffice to say that people were flooding in by the thousands. I mean, on some days there was more than 1,000 people joining these Facebook. First, there was one Facebook page, then I opened a COVID-19 Facebook page the day we went into lockdown. And then by the time we were sort of 3 months into the pandemic, the conversation was completely dominated by parosmia. And at that point, I opened another Facebook group called the Parosmia and Phantosmia Support Group. So can we now go into the next slide, please? And one of the things that I did in these these were closed Facebook groups with thousands and thousands of people. And of course, that became a sort of nightmare of moderation, making sure that there wasn't a lot of misinformation there. But it was very, very tightly moderated by me and a very small group of helpers. And one of the things that we did, which was quite interesting, was to put out a poll and ask people various questions. And in this question that you're looking at right now, we asked people, how does parosmia make you feel? And what you're seeing there is, it's weighted, so frustrating, depressing, those were things that were mentioned over and over again. And as you can see, there is a substantial amount of emotional conflict present when people experience parosmia. And that has to do with not understanding what it is, having this, as Rachel was talking about, the sense of self, that's kind of been turned on its head. And really, I think that it's important to highlight that even people who have the condition take a very long time to make sense of it. It takes a while, and you just don't understand what's happening. So may I have the next slide, please? Now, I had noticed even before the pandemic happened that when we had conversations about parosmia, we were hearing about the same foods over and over again. And I spoke at a conference in Amsterdam in March of 2019, and I gave a little talk about parosmia to some flavorists. And I met, after that event, I met Professor Jane Parker in the audience, and she came to me and she said, I think I know what's going on based on the foods that you've described. So if I could have the next slide. The next thing that happened was that I began collaborating with the University of Reading on this parosmia research. And I did that, as I said, with Professor Jane Parker. We started interviewing people who had parosmia and putting them on the GCO machine, which was an elaborate device which takes a smell and chops it up in tiny little individual pieces so that we can then find out which of those individual constituents to a smell. And for instance, coffee, which is what we researched, has hundreds of compounds in it. And this machine makes it possible to smell one compound at a time, so that when the person was sitting there with their nose in the cone, as you see me here doing, and they smell the really bad thing, they say, that's the thing, that's the smell. Yeah, so we were well stuck into it when the pandemic hit. And of course, it was very interesting to see we had pre-pandemic parosmics, and then we had post-pandemic parosmics. May I have the next slide, please? So all of this work culminated in the original paper, which came out in Communications Medicine and identified the triggering molecules. And that was Jane, as I mentioned, and then Simon Gain, who was my ENT trustee at Absent. And that was, I feel like what was wonderful about this piece of research is that it took comments and input from the patient group, put that together with researchers that could help us, and out came a really interesting paper that would never have happened if it hadn't been for patients talking amongst themselves and, finding a commonality in our experience that was useful to science. May I have the next slide, please? So this is a page from the paper, and what I want to add at this point is, yes, this is really interesting for science. We're really making a chink in parosmia, which prior to that had been a sort of black box. Nobody knew really what it was. If you read the descriptions, they say, yes, these are these distorted smells, but no one really knew what they were. So yes, it was wonderful that we were able to identify these molecules. Meanwhile, what about the patients? What is happening to them and how are they coping? And, I think that researchers want to ask research questions and have them answered, but patients want a better quality of life. And sometimes those two goals don't necessarily seem like they've been brought together properly. May I have the next slide, please? So meanwhile, back in the parosmia group, I asked another question, and I asked people what were their tips and tricks? How were they managing? What were some advice that they could give to new people? Because we had this constant stream of new people. We had people that had been there for a couple of months, and we know now that the acute parosmia phase, the one that is so anxiety inducing, can last for up to a year. But I've never heard of anyone who remained at that intensity of anxiety for a really extended period, thank goodness. And when we asked people for their tips and tricks, this again is a weighted word cloud that shows the kind of things that people described. I mean, I remember one woman had this brilliant idea. She loved coffee. She couldn't drink coffee. She missed it terribly. And she hit on the idea of drinking iced coffee through a straw. So she got her caffeine. She still enjoyed going out for her coffee, but she could swallow it down, get the caffeine without being overwhelmed by the coffee smell that you might get if you went into Starbucks or another coffee shop. So it was things like that that were really, really helpful, I think. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to play you 3 short videos from people in the private network, the CKOS network. And we have a very lively discussion going on all the time about parosmia. And here are 3 of our members talking about their particular case of parosmia.
Hello, my name is Selfie Sayan and I got COVID November 2021 and developed parosmia February 2022. And yeah, how is it to me to live with parosmia? It affected all aspects of my life, and it feels like I lost one part of myself and that I can't trust my taste and smell anymore. And that's why I don't feel safe in my own body and outside in the world. And yeah, and I feel often sick because of the bad smells and taste. And this whole situation made me depressive and anxious person. And yeah, and I feel helpless and hopeless because there is no treatment for this condition. Thank you for listening.
I'm Angie. My anosmia began after testing positive to COVID in September 21. Parosmia began 3 months later, and phantosmia began after another 2 weeks. I still experience all 3, so it's been about 2.5 years for me now. With regards to parosmia, I can barely smell or taste anything, but can vividly smell rancidness, rotten vegetables, and burnt toast. Along with food, hygiene and cleaning products can be distorted too. I have safe and unsafe food lists, which change over time. However, there's been little improvement. I eat for crunch, pop and chew, and food presentation and colour is important. as is contrasting temperature and chilly heat. So what do I miss? The experience of sharing a meal and having memories triggered by certain foods. Thank you for listening.
Hello, my name's Paula, and I have parosmia. I experienced a traumatic brain injury in January 2023, and about 5 or so months after that, I started to develop parosmia after having no sense of smell or taste at all. It's very much like a daily torture. That's the only way I can describe it. It's hard to tell people what you're experiencing and what the smells are and the tastes are that you're having. It's taken away my favourite foods, everything to do with garlic, onions, curries, that sort of thing. I've become very adept at spotting people with a cigarette in their hands in the street, so it does make you feel quite alienated from a social perspective because of avoiding lots of things to do with food and drink, unfortunately.
I'd just like to add a couple of more things here that I've been thinking about while listening to those videos. There seems to be, people seem to want to discount their recovering sense of smell if it is not 100% the way they recognize it. And Stephanie, you mentioned this earlier on. People who have parosmia will say, I don't have a sense of smell because it doesn't feel like the sense of smell that serves them. But I always try and help people to understand that any kind of smell signal means that there is some activation in the nerve, and that is what we hope to build on with olfactory training. I do think that is a very, very important distinction, and one that is, there's of course, we're all different. We all respond to our recovery, to food, to olfactory training, to parosmia differently. But I do think that it's important to educate people, to help them understand what recovery, what healing actually is, and how they can maybe approach it with an open mind when it's so difficult. If you are in the throes of a deep depression, as I was also in the early part of my smell loss. And otherwise, I would like to thank you for your attention, and again, thank the organizers for having me. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you brought up smell training and recovery, because that is so key. And I know that not only did smell training help me, and it's helped so many others. It is useful even to enhance your overall wellness. And it's one of the many things that we are looking at the World Taste and Smell Association. We're actually going to be fielding some research coming at the end of the summer and in the fall about the range in the way that people experience taste and smell, their overall kind of social involvement with their own sense of smell and taste, and behavioral aspects of taste and smell. So do stay tuned for that. I encourage anybody to put questions in the Q&A if you've got some, because we'd love to answer them if you could stick around. And then I do just want to point out there will be some resources that we'll put on the screen. We'll also send them to you via email. And I just want to ask all of you to reach out if you do have some time and some interest in getting involved in spreading awareness of taste and smell. Please send me a note. Stephanie at WTSDA.org. There are a million ways that you could get involved, and we'd love to have you.
So
there is a question. Oh, go ahead.
Stephanie, you go ahead. There is a question, so I'll let you handle it.
As a wine and beer sommelier, are there any recommendations on how to expand and get better at smell and flavor?
I have an idea on that. I mean, can I jump in with my thoughts on that, Stephanie?
Please.
I think that the best thing for anyone to do who is trying to find a beverage that they like is to always approach that by comparing 2 or even 3 things. And you will always find one thing that you like more than another. It helps to do that with other people, so you don't have to open a lot of bottles of wine, but you might go to a restaurant where you order 3 different glasses of wine in your group. I do think that the comparison technique for everything, not just drink, but that goes for food, that goes for different kinds of textures. That's such an important part of finding pleasure, finding your way back to pleasure in food, is allowing yourself to make a decision about something that you like more than something else.
That's actually really, really brilliant, Chrissy, because I had not thought about the comparison aspect of it. And I think that that's really a critical point, that the other thing that comparing is doing, which I think is the underlining message to all of this with respect to improving one's sense of smell and taste and flavor, is that the more input you give your sensory systems, the more exercise you give them, the more you have the potential for stimulating them back to normal or back to better at some level. So the more that you try, and the comparison is a brilliant version of trying, and it's sort of forcing yourself to try more than one thing and getting discouraged and saying, okay, forget it. But the more that you actively engage your sense of smell and taste and flavor, the more you have the potential for recovery.
And of course, there are different aspects to the sense of smell. I mean, if you think about the sniff and sticks test, which measures 3 parameters, threshold or sensitivity, discrimination, and identification. So when you're doing the comparing exercise, you are actually exercising the discrimination part of your olfactory system. And I do think that's a really an excellent technique and a really important one.
There are 2 questions that are related to smell training. One is about whether essential oils can be used, and the other is whether there are any studies suggesting that we should continue smell training indefinitely.
So I could start there, and Chrissy, you can follow up. So first of all, the actual chemical composition of the scent does not matter. So as long as it's not toxic. So it doesn't matter whether it's an essential oil, whether you brought in a rose from your garden, whether you went to the store and bought peanut butter, or you went to your perfume counter or wherever else you got the scent, as long as you are actively engaging in sniffing and thinking about the scent that you're smelling, even if you can't actually smell it. So even though you may not be able to smell peanut butter, you know that this is peanut butter, and you know that you used to like peanut butter sandwiches. And so you're making this sort of mental and sensory connection, even if the perception isn't what you expect or want it to be. So that connection is really critical. And absolutely, every day for the rest of your life, everybody should be exercising their nose, just like you want to take walks, just like if you go to the gym, just like if you do any stretching. You want to be actually doing active input to your sense of smell, because this is critical, not just for all the pleasures and wonders that the sense of smell brings, but because of the really, really intimate and direct connection to the parts of the brain where thinking and memory and associations and complex cognition and emotions and our general well-being is taking place. It's extremely important that those are activated, and that will keep your brain and body healthy.
And I would also like to go back to the question on essential oils. I mean, essential oils have been used, of course, for olfactory training, for smell training now for a long time, but merely because they are convenient, small packages of highly scented product. And I know that, I mean, I have seen it advertised, I've seen smell training advertised as essential oil therapy and all kinds of things. It's not about the essential oil. It's about what your brain is doing at the time that you are smell training. And, what Rachel says is right. You want to get into the habit of exercising your sense of smell, but you could also think of it as a kind of I know we overuse the word mindfulness all the time, but it's so easy to get out of the habit of smelling, smelling with intention. Of course, we smell passively, but there are plenty of times when we put our nose to something to smell, and it's very easy to get out of that habit. And if you can reawaken that impulse to be aware of smell, I think, you don't even have to do it in a way that is, let's say, organized. You sit down with something in front of you and you say, now I'm going to do this exercise. But rather, as you go through your day, whether you're brushing your teeth or you're getting dressed or you're in the shower or you're getting into your car or you're opening your wallet to take some coins out, virtually everything in our environment has smell. And so you want to try and tune into that again.
So there's a question, a comment in the chat about using a zester. I think that's a fabulous idea. To not just essential oils, but also, zesting lemon or lime. Another question from the chat. I had a tumor in my ethmoid, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, sinus in 2007. Part of the surgery required the removal of my olfactory bulb. So I have acquired anosmia. I worry about the emotional stunting. Is that a thing that will get worse, Rachel?
So it probably will get worse, but I would say that the person who is aware of that concern is actually at a great advantage, because anytime one is aware of something that could be happening, you can take extra steps to sort of buffer and support the sorts of loss that you may actually experience. So if you are, again, and I love Chrissy's comment about the intentionality. So the intentionality of recognizing that you need to have some greater degree of sort of emotional connection to what is going on around you, that it might not just sort of happen automatically, can help you address situations, probably most importantly interpersonally. But I would just be sort of on top of it for yourself to try to be aware of how you can kind of expand your emotional experiences with people at a sort of deliberate level, even if it's not happening to quite the same extent automatically.
Another question. Is there more research being done on molecule triggers?
Do you mean like specific molecules capable of doing particular things? Is that what the...
I suspect that it had to do with some of what Chrissy was describing.
Yeah, so parosmia molecule molecular triggers of parosmia. As far as I know, I mean, it has been talked about, but I don't know if there's any actually ongoing now.
Now, another question about the smell training. Does olfactory stimulation hold the potential to reduce or potentially reverse the decline in olfactory sense association with aging?
Yes. So it has actually been shown in a number of studies that actively using your nose, deliberately, intentionally sniffing increases not only the olfactory capability of someone with a just sort of through aging diminishing sense of smell, but also cognition. So memory, executive function, general cognitive fluency, all of those are actually enhanced. And there have been a number of studies showing that. So I would definitely say that regardless of one's sense of smell, one's sense of cognitive capability, that always doing active smell training is something that's going to lead to a healthier brain overall and over one's lifespan.
We have a couple of questions about recovery. Whether it's possible to recover from hyposmia after a year, and with COVID, is smell or taste the first to come back?
Well, if I could just jump in, I would say recovery after 1 year is most definitely possible. Like I said, it can take years, and people can help themselves with olfactory training, by smell training. So I think that's a really important message. And Stephanie, what was the second question? Second part of the question?
With COVID, does smell or taste come back first?
I think that's so individual. I've heard both. Rachel, what are your thoughts?
Well, again, I think it comes a little bit to the conflation of people saying taste when they really mean flavor, and whether or not they've actually lost their sense of taste, which is in fact more rare. It does occur with COVID. It has occurred. It's not that it doesn't, but it's actually much more common that person who's lost their sense of smell, and they're saying, because food is so altered and their sense of flavor is not happening, that they say taste. So in that case, it's probably, smell and taste seem to quote unquote come back at once. When it's the pure loss of taste, I actually, and maybe Chrissy, you know this more from your patient experiences, I have heard more from the literature that it seems to be more one or the other when it's the true loss of the chemical sense. They can be interrelated. Also, the loss of, let's say, the spiciness or the burn of certain foods. That's the trigeminal function. So all the sort of sensory experience of eating, smelling, feeling foods in one's mouth, they can all be affected, or they can be affected to varying degrees, or only one of them can be affected with COVID. And I think the problem is with food, because the experience is so intermingled, knowing whether or not it's smell, taste, flavor, trigeminal, burn, and bite, it's hard to decipher.
I know
So
that
we have,
sorry,
go.
We tried to drill down into this question a lot in sort of between year 1 and year 2 of the pandemic, because we had so many people saying that very thing, Rachel. So, and we not being sure whether they meant taste or flavor. It did appear, after questioning, clarification, talking about it in a webinar to people in the group, that there were some people who felt that they could experience, and let's call it for what it is, retronasal olfaction, but they weren't experiencing orthonasal olfaction. And that also seemed to be available in the swapped around variant. So I don't know. I think there are still plenty of things that we don't know about this. And certainly with COVID, I mean, the earliest cases of COVID, the first 2 variants, caused so many other weird changes to smell and taste, and mouth changes and tongue changes, and just weird experiences that I don't think we've even scratched the surface on what was going on there.
Yeah, and just as kind of a follow-up commentary, I mean, even though there was a consortium of researchers that got together at the beginning of COVID to really try to come to answers, unfortunately, I don't think that there was enough really good research done on collecting information about everything that was going on with patients, the different degrees of actual function, loss of function, and so forth, for us to really know. I mean, even today, what I said about 30 million people worldwide still have persistent smell loss, that number is not quite pulled out of my hat with a rabbit, but it's basically no one actually has a clear number for that. I mean, that comes out of a paper, but it is not actually a definitive number. Is that number growing? Is it actually diminishing? Are people actually recovering since that paper came out? So it's really unclear what's really going on.
And also when we see research on, let's say follow-up studies, looking at people over a period of time. I mean, the periods of time that we're looking at are 2 years is the longest one that I think I've seen. So, and we are 4 years into the pandemic. So naturally, interest by researchers and clinicians is waning on this field, unfortunately, while they turn their sights onto other things that seem more pressing. And unfortunately, there is a real lack of truly long-term studies. I mean, interestingly, in the CKOS network right now, the private network, when the people come in, I ask them to answer a couple of questions, and one of them is, how did you lose your sense of smell? So the number of people who are fresh cases of smell loss from COVID is greatly diminished. And we maintain quite a large number of people who had COVID, who have not recovered, who still feel that their sense of smell is poor or challenged, or they're still getting to grips with it. So there are plenty of long-term people out there. They may be a very tiny number, but the people that are out there that have come into the group, they are still suffering.
There's some discussion in the chat I just want to call attention to about Safety, food safety, identifying food and sour milk, rancid things, smoke. And one suggestion was that you put timers on everything when you're cooking, and use sensors. I know for me, I had to learn to get brave about asking people, is this okay? Does this smell good? Does this look good? Does this taste good? Do you have other suggestions for overall food safety? And then related, particularly when you have parosmia, how do you get enough good nutrition?
One thing I can just say about the food safety is that hopefully in the future, this is actually a technology that's being used to a certain extent, but not nearly as much as it should be. And I think it will be coming, are actual little chemical sensors inside foods, especially for canned foods. Now, of course, it's a little harder if you've already opened something up and it's sitting in your refrigerator and just trying to figure out, is it still good? But actually chemical sensors within canned foods and other types of foods that will indicate when the chemistry of that food product has altered and is then giving off a gas that could indicate that this is no longer fresh. So that sort of best by date is, some approximation, but rather than just actually using that as sort of a general go by, this would be something that would actually be detecting the chemistry of what is being potentially consumed. I would say that there's a lot of information from chefs and other things that tell you, like, for instance, even though rice looks like it should be completely fine because it's bland and white, that actually you should not keep rice in your refrigerator for more than, 48 hours, that it can actually develop a lot of bacteria on it really, really quickly. Other foods, which, have even a shorter life in your refrigerator once they've been opened, others which can last longer. So there's probably some specific information on that, and I'll let Chrissy deal with the parosmia part of that question.
So I think the question that I think was asked, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, was how to get nutrition if you've got parosmia. Is that right?
Yes, and then the other part of that actually was, is it possible to recover after 2 years?
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, yes, of course, recovery is possible after 2 years. So just hang in there. How do you get nutrition? Well, this is a really tough one because obviously as the person said, a lot of the protein sources are ruled out because they find them disgusting. I can give you a couple of tips for parosmia that is just impossible to live with. You should try a meal replacement like Huel we have in this country. I don't know if you have it in the US, but some kind of meal replacement that is a complete food. Now, don't go to the health food store and buy a protein powder, because protein powder alone made into a smoothie is not rounded enough, and it can be, I think, put pressure, or can be very challenging for your liver, or kidneys, maybe is what I mean. Kidneys. So try not to resort to protein powders, but look for a more rounded food shake supplement, the kind of thing that you might give to someone who had had dental surgery and couldn't chew, or someone who is recovering, an elderly person who's recovering. Complan shakes, for instance, they don't taste great, but if you can get unsweetened, unflavored, all the better. Moving on from that, getting your protein. You may find that different kinds of cooking techniques will make food more palatable, and eating food when it's cold will be more palatable. So while most people with parosmia will recoil gagging from a roast chicken, a cold chicken sandwich with the skin removed is absolutely fine and even palatable. So I would encourage you to try those. Another one is ham. So people can't eat a pork chop or anything with pork in it, and yet a cold ham sandwich, for reasons that no one understands, is okay. So you really do have to, and parosmia will be different for everyone. So what works for me may not work for you, and vice versa. So you have to try and stay curious and keep trying food. I know that sounds awful if you feel sick, but just keep after it until you find, one thing that you can eat, and hopefully it's not going to be, cool cheese nachos, or, all these things that people do resort to because they have that wonderful combination of fat and salt or fat and sugar.
So people provide a lot of this information in some of the groups, and particularly in the CKOS network. If we could go to the resource slide so people could take a look, they will also be sent to you. And there is one last question because we've gone over, and I thank you everybody for staying with us, and I thank our panelists for staying with us. But the question is about something that you mentioned, Rachel, and I'm not sure there is an answer to this, but it's a statistic that really has always troubled me, that you're 4 times more likely to die within 5 years. Even, looking at all those other conditions that you might have, and why is that with smell loss?
So actually, I think that there is a reason that's not mysterious. So first of all, there's the greater likelihood of just danger because you weren't able to detect something going off in your environment. But actually, what I think is the more important and more interesting part of this is that because your olfactory receptors are directly exposed to the environment, they are the first line of defense for what is going on in your environment. So if you're in a toxic environment for whatever reasons, just systemically because of where you live or what you work with, the materials you work with, or whatever else, your sense of smell is going to be affected first because they're what are receiving this input, especially if it's some kind of chemical that's in the air. So what is going on, I believe, in these cases is that your sense of smell is faltering, and it's actually an indication for potentially larger organ failure sort of throughout your body, which will then lead to an early death. So the specific causes have not been specifically identified in it's this organ or that organ that may be affected by these kinds of toxins in the environment, and that's why these people have lost their sense of smell. But the general trajectory of your sense of smell being the bellwether, the kind of the canary in the coal mine for your environment being potentially unhealthy, and that having a long-term then impact on your internal system, and that leading to an earlier death seems to be the explanation for that statistic, which sounds scary and menacing, but I think is something that should really be taken seriously. And as you also mentioned, Stephanie, like moving from this city to the countryside. I mean, of course, not everyone can afford this. It's so many people can't afford this to change their environment for various reasons, whether it's just pure economics or even the jobs that they have, which may be actually dangerous from the point of view of general health, but something to be aware of and actually something to bring up, just like any other health hazard would be.
Thank you, Rachel. You always know the stuff, and it is just fabulous for you to be part of this. And Chrissy, thank you so much for sharing your information. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. It's really, we say that smell is underrated and smell and taste are so involved, and people don't with one another, and people don't always get it. And I hope that we've shared some knowledge with you and you will spread the word. The recording will be available. We'll send out a link to you in the email that you use to register. And please look at our website, tasteandsmell.world. And please reach out if you would like to get involved with us. Thank you so much.